How one farmer's gapped board corncrib made ears dry faster than the weather. Walter Henshaw stood at the kitchen window on a November morning in 1929, watching smoke rise from the pile of corn he was burning in the back field. His wife Margaret stood behind him, one hand on his shoulder, saying nothing because there was nothing to say. That pile represented 6 months of work, thousands of dollars they did not have, and a winter they would now spend wondering how they were going to keep the farm. The corn had molded in the crib, all of it. 40% of their entire harvest rotted through with that distinctive sweet, sick smell that meant money turning into garbage. Walter was 31 years old that morning. He had taken over his father's farm 3 years earlier, when the old man's heart finally gave out after 72 years of hard Iowa living. He had a wife, 2 daughters aged 5 and 3, a mortgage that felt like a millstone around his neck, and now a disaster that might cost him everything his family had built over 2 generations. The corn had gone into the crib in October with too much moisture still in the kernels. The fall had been wet, unseasonably warm, and the ears had not dried in the field the way they should have. Walter had known it was risky storing wet corn, but what else could he do? Leave it in the field to rot, sell it immediately at rock-bottom prices because everyone else was trying to sell wet corn too. He had gambled that it would dry in storage over the winter. He had lost that gamble. Margaret finally spoke. She said they would figure something out. They always did. But her voice had that tight quality it got when she was scared, and Walter knew she was thinking about the girls, about what would happen if they lost the farm, about where they would go and how they would live. Her father had warned her about marrying a farmer. Farmers, he had said, spent their whole lives at the mercy of things they could not control. Weather, markets, insects, disease. One bad year could wipe you out. Margaret had married Walter anyway because she loved him and because she believed he was smart enough and stubborn enough to make it work. Now, watching that smoke rise, she was probably wondering if her father had been right. Walter made a decision that morning that would change his life and eventually change corn farming across the entire Midwest, though he had no way of knowing that at the time. He decided he was not going to let this happen again. He did not care what it took or how long it took or who thought he was crazy. He was going to figure out how to keep corn from rotting in storage, and he was going to do it in a way that actually worked. He started reading everything he could find. The local library in Carroll had maybe 3 books on agriculture, and Walter read all of them twice. He wrote letters to the Agriculture Extension Office at Iowa State College, asking for bulletins and research papers. He subscribed to farming journals that cost money they could barely spare. But Margaret did not complain, because she understood that Walter needed to feel like he was doing something. All through the winter of 29 and into 30, while the country slid into the Depression and corn prices dropped to levels that made growing it almost pointless, Walter filled notebooks with information about moisture content, air circulation, temperature gradients, and grain storage. His daughters thought their father had become strange. He would stand in the old corn crib for long stretches, just staring at the walls, running his hands over the boards. He would hold his wetted finger up to feel which way air was moving. He would place thermometers at different heights and depths in the crib and check them multiple times a day, recording the numbers in his notebooks. The girls told their friends at school that their daddy was studying corn, which the other children found hilarious because what was there to study about corn? You planted it, you grew it, you picked it, you stored it. Everybody knew how to do that. But Walter had realized something that seemed obvious once he thought about it, but that no one around him appeared to have considered. Corn was alive, in a sense. The kernels were seeds, and seeds contained moisture, and that moisture had to go somewhere. In a sealed-up crib with solid walls, the moisture coming off thousands of ears of corn just sat there in the air, making everything inside humid and perfect for mold. You were asking corn to dry itself out, while it was essentially sitting in its own sweat. It could not work. It was like trying to dry clothes in a closed closet. What if, Walter thought, you could keep the air moving? What if instead of trapping the moist air inside the crib, you let it escape and pulled in fresh, dry air to replace it? The problem was doing that without also letting in rain, snow, birds, mice, and everything else that would ruin stored corn. It was a puzzle, and Walter loved puzzles in a way that Margaret said was not entirely healthy for a grown man. He started sketching designs. He filled page after page with drawings of cribs that had louvers, vents, adjustable panels, all sorts of complicated systems for managing airflow. Margaret would find these drawings on the kitchen table in the morning, covered with coffee stains and eraser marks, and she would sigh and make breakfast and wonder if her husband was having some kind of breakdown. But she did not say anything, because she had seen the look on his face when they burned that corn. And she knew he was working something out in the only way he knew how. The breakthrough came in the spring of 1932. Walter was rebuilding a section of fence, and he was spacing the boards to save lumber because money was still desperately tight. As he worked, he noticed how the wind moved through those gaps. Even when the air seemed still, there was circulation between the boards. Cool air on one side, warmer air on the other, and the temperature difference created a gentle but constant movement. He stood there with a hammer in his hand, and suddenly he knew exactly how to build his corn crib. That evening at dinner, he told Margaret he was going to tear down the old crib and build a new one with gaps between all the boards. She put down her fork and looked at him for a long moment. Then she asked how much it would cost. He told her it would actually be cheaper because they would use less lumber overall. She asked if he was sure it would work. He said he was not sure of anything except that the old way definitely did not work, so they might as well try something different. Margaret nodded slowly. She said if they were going to risk looking like fools, they might as well do it properly. Walter started building in June. His brother James came over one afternoon, saw what Walter was doing, and asked if he had lost his mind. Those gaps, James said, would let the rain right in. Walter explained about airflow and moisture transfer and continuous ventilation. James listened, then shook his head and said their father would be spinning in his grave to see good lumber wasted on a half-finished building. Walter kept building. James left, and Walter heard later that his brother had told half the county that Walter Henshaw was building a corn crib that looked like he had run out of boards halfway through. The neighbors talked. Of course they talked. In a farming community where everyone knew everyone else's business, Walter's strange crib was the most interesting thing that had happened in months. People would drive past slowly, gawking at the structure taking shape in Walter's farmyard. At the feed store in town, men would ask each other if they had seen Henshaw's crib, and they would shake their heads and make jokes about how some people had more education than common sense. Walter had gone to 2 years of agricultural college before his father got sick, and there was a persistent belief among some of the older farmers that college taught you a lot of theory but nothing practical. Margaret heard the talk. Women would mention it at church. In that way, women have of saying something without quite saying it directly. They would ask how Walter was doing, and was he feeling all right, and was there anything they could do to help. Margaret smiled and thanked them and said Walter was fine, he was just trying something new. But at home, in bed at night, she would ask Walter if he was sure about this. He would say no, he was not sure, but he was committed now and they would find out together. She would lie there in the dark, listening to her husband breathe, and pray that he was right. The crib went up over the summer. Walter cut boards and spaced them 3/4 of an inch apart, running them horizontal around the entire structure. He put wire mesh behind the gaps to keep out pests. He built the crib 14 feet wide, which seemed narrow to anyone used to the big solid cribs that were sometimes 20 feet across. But Walter had calculated that air needed to be able to reach the center of the corn pile. He worked alone mostly, because no one volunteered to help with a project they thought was doomed. His daughters would come out after school and hand him nails, and he would explain to them what he was doing and why. They did not really understand, but they liked being with their father, and they liked that he talked to them like they were smart enough to follow along. By October of 32, the crib was finished. Harvest came and Walter filled it with corn. He had had a decent crop that year, about average for the conditions, and as he piled the ears into his new crib, he felt his stomach tighten with anxiety. This was it. This would either work or it would not. And if it did not, he would have to stand in front of the entire community and admit he had been wrong. More than that, he would have lost another year's income, and they were barely holding on as it was. The first test came quickly. A warm spell moved through Iowa in mid-November, the kind of Indian summer warmth that felt nice, but made farmers nervous. Warm, humid air was the enemy of drying corn. Inside traditional cribs all over Carroll County, corn that had been slowly giving up its moisture suddenly stopped drying. Some farmers opened their crib doors to try to get more air circulation, but on still days it did not help much. They stood in their farmyards looking at their cribs and worried. Walter stood in his farmyard too, but he was watching his crib with fascination. Even on the stillest days, he could feel air moving through those gaps. He could hold his hand up to the boards and feel cool air coming out on one side, warmer air going in on the other. The temperature difference between inside and outside was creating circulation all by itself. He checked his thermometers, took moisture readings, recorded everything in his notebooks. The corn was drying. Slowly, steadily, it was drying. By early December, Walter was confident enough to take measurements that he knew were accurate. His corn was testing at 16% moisture. He did not tell anyone yet. He wanted to be absolutely certain before he said anything. He waited another 2 weeks, tested again, got the same results. 16%. At 16%, corn was stable. It could be stored indefinitely without mold risk. Most farmers would be happy to get their corn down to 18 or 19% by December. Walter had 16. He decided to invite some neighbors over to see for themselves. He mentioned it casually at church one Sunday in mid-December, said he had some interesting results from his new crib design, and anyone who wanted to come take a look was welcome. About a dozen men showed up the following Saturday, including his brother James and Raymond Kolb, who was known as one of the most successful farmers in the county. Raymond had recently bought one of the new moisture meters, which were expensive gadgets that most farmers could not afford, but which gave accurate readings of grain moisture content. The men stood around in Walter's farmyard, stamping their feet against the cold, skeptical expressions on their faces. Walter did not give a speech. He just climbed up the side of the crib, pulled out an ear of corn and handed it to Raymond. Raymond tested it. 16.2%. He frowned, pulled out another ear from a different spot. 15.9%. He tested 20 samples total, moving all around the crib, pulling ears from different depths. Every single one came back between 15 and 17% moisture. The men stood there in silence for a moment. Then Raymond asked what Walter's corn had tested at when it went into the crib back in October. Walter checked his notebook. 22%. Raymond nodded slowly. His own corn had gone in at 21%, and it was currently sitting at 19%. He had lost 2 percentage points of moisture in 2 months. Walter had lost 6. James Henshaw cleared his throat and said, "Well, maybe Walter had not lost his mind after all." A few of the other men laughed, breaking the tension. They started asking questions. How wide were the gaps? What kind of wire mesh? How much had it cost? How deep was the corn pile? Walter answered every question, showed them his drawings, explained his reasoning. The skepticism was gone now, replaced by genuine interest. These were practical men, and they could recognize a practical solution when they saw one work. The story spread quickly after that. By January of '33, Walter was getting visits from farmers all over Carroll County, and even from neighboring counties. Everyone wanted to see the gapped board crib. He became a local celebrity in a quiet, rural sort of way. The same men who had mocked his design 6 months earlier were now asking his advice on how to build their own versions. Walter helped anyone who asked. He shared his drawings freely, explained the principles, even went to some farms to help plan crib placements for optimal wind exposure. Margaret watched her husband become confident in a way he had not been since before his father died. He had always been a good farmer, competent and hard-working, but there had been something tentative about him, as if he was always waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the next disaster to strike. Now he walked differently. He spoke with authority when neighbors asked him questions. He had solved a real problem, and he knew it, and that knowledge changed something fundamental in him. Their older daughter, who was 8 by then, asked her mother one night why everyone was suddenly being so nice to Daddy. Margaret thought about how to explain it. She said that sometimes people do not believe something is possible until someone shows them it can be done. Your father, she said, was brave enough to try something everyone else thought was foolish. And because he was right, he made things better not just for us, but for everyone around us. The girl thought about that. She asked if that meant Daddy was a hero. Margaret smiled and said he was not a hero exactly, but he was the kind of person who made the world a little bit better, and that was its own kind of special. By the spring of '33, At least 15 farmers in Carroll County had either built new gapped board cribs or modified their existing ones. The design spread through the Midwest over the next few years, carried by word of mouth, by farmers visiting other farms, by agricultural extension agents who finally recognized what Walter had demonstrated. The Iowa State College Extension Service published official plans for gapped board cribs in '37, complete with technical specifications and construction details. Those plans were distributed to thousands of farmers across Iowa, Illinois, Nebraska, Indiana, and Ohio. The impact was measurable and significant. Storage losses from mold and spoilage dropped dramatically wherever the new cribs were adopted. For farmers operating on razor-thin margins during the Depression, saving even a few percentage points of their harvest could mean the difference between making the mortgage payment and losing the farm. Walter's design, born from personal disaster and stubborn determination, helped hundreds of families keep their land. Walter never sought recognition beyond his local community. He was not the kind of man who wanted fame or attention. He had solved a problem that was hurting him, and in doing so, he had helped his neighbors. That was enough. He farmed his land for another 36 years, raised his daughters, watched them marry and have children of their own. He and Margaret celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1977. He died the following spring at 79 years old in the same farmhouse where he had made the decision to figure out how to store corn properly. His grandson, who had gone to Iowa State and studied agricultural engineering, found one of Walter's original notebooks years later while cleaning out the old farmhouse. It was dated 1930 to 32, filled with calculations, sketches, moisture readings, and observations written in Walter's careful handwriting. On one page, dated November 1929, there was a single sentence that the grandson found particularly moving. It said, "I will not let this happen again." The gapped board crib that Walter built in 1932 stood on the farm until 1983, when it was finally torn down to make room for modern grain handling equipment. By then, it had been superseded by mechanized drying systems, by forced air ventilation with electric fans, by all the technological advances that came with cheap electricity and agricultural industrialization. But the principle Walter had demonstrated remained valid. Corn needed to give up its moisture to moving air. The faster you could replace humid air with dry air, the faster the corn dried and the safer it was in storage. Whether you accomplished that with gaps between boards or with powerful fans was just a matter of scale and economics. The physics had not changed. There is something profoundly American about Walter Henshaw's story. He was not a scientist or an engineer, though he educated himself enough to understand the principles he needed. He was not wealthy or politically connected. He was just a farmer who refused to accept that the way things had always been done was the only way to do them. He risked looking foolish in front of his community. He invested time and limited resources in an unproven idea. And when it worked, he shared it freely with anyone who wanted to learn. That kind of practical innovation, born from necessity and tested through real-world application, is what built American agriculture. It was not usually universities or corporations driving change, though they played their roles. It was individual farmers working on their own land, solving problems that directly affected their survival, and then sharing what they learned with their neighbors. That person-to-person transmission of knowledge, that willingness to experiment and to help others, created a culture of continuous improvement that made American farms the most productive in the world. Walter's story also reminds us that innovation requires courage. His neighbors were not wrong to be skeptical. Farming operates on thin margins, and a failed experiment can mean genuine hardship. The pressure to conform, to do what everyone else does, is not just social but economic. If you do something different and it fails, you fail alone. If you do what everyone else does and it fails, at least you all fail together. Walter chose to risk failing alone, and that took a particular kind of bravery. The warm, humid spell that hit Iowa in November of '32 was the test that proved Walter's design. Without that specific weather challenge happening at that specific time, his neighbors might not have noticed how much better his corn was drying. Timing matters in innovation. The right solution at the wrong time may not get adopted. The right solution at the right time, demonstrated clearly when people are paying attention, can spread like wildfire. Margaret Henshaw deserves recognition too. She supported her husband through what must have seemed like an obsessive and possibly financially reckless project. She defended him to the community when people questioned his judgment. She maintained the household and raised their daughters, while Walter filled notebooks and built his experimental crib. Behind most successful farmers, there were farm wives who made success possible through their own labor, their own sacrifices, and their own faith in their husbands. Margaret was one of those women, and without her support, Walter's crib might never have been built. The children who grew up on farms in the 30s and 40s, watching their fathers build gapped board cribs, probably never realized they were witnessing a significant moment in agricultural history. To them, it was just the way cribs were built. That is how cultural knowledge works. One generation's innovation becomes the next generation's standard practice, so seamless and unremarkable that its origins are forgotten. By the time Walter's grandchildren were farming, they had no personal memory of solid-walled cribs or the problems they caused. The knowledge had been so thoroughly integrated into farming practice that it seemed like it had always been that way. There is a particular nostalgia in rural communities for the era of hand-built solutions and individual ingenuity. The gapped board crib represents that time before farming became dominated by corporate agriculture and expensive machinery, when a farmer with basic carpentry skills and a good idea could make a real difference. That era is gone now, for better and worse. Modern farming is more productive, more efficient, more scientifically managed, but it has lost some of the personal creativity and community knowledge sharing that characterized earlier generations. The Grange Hall, where Walter first presented his idea to skeptical neighbors, is still standing in Carroll County, though it is used for different purposes now. The feed store where men gossiped about his crazy crib design is long closed. The farms themselves have changed beyond recognition, consolidated into larger operations, equipped with technology Walter could never have imagined. But the stories persist. Old-timers still talk about Walter Henshaw and his gapped board crib, usually when someone proposes doing something differently than it has always been done. They say, "Remember Walter Henshaw? Everyone thought he was crazy too." That is the ultimate legacy of innovation in rural communities. It becomes part of the collective memory, a story that gets told and retold, reshaped and embellished with each telling, until the details blur, but the essential truth remains. Someone had the courage to try something different and it worked, and it made life better for everyone around them. Those stories matter because they create a culture that values problem-solving and rewards innovation, even when innovation looks risky or foolish at first. Walter Henshaw never wrote a book or gave a famous speech or had a building named after him. But thousands of farmers built gapped board cribs based on his design. Millions of bushels of corn were saved from spoilage because of the principle he demonstrated. And countless farmers over the decades were inspired by his story to try their own improvements, to question their own assumptions, to risk looking foolish in pursuit of a better way. That ripple effect, impossible to quantify but undeniably real, is the true measure of his contribution. On that November morning in 1929, watching smoke rise from a pile of rotting corn, Walter Henshaw had a choice. He could accept this loss as the kind of random misfortune that farmers endure, shrug it off, rebuild, and try again. Or he could refuse to accept it, could decide that there had to be a better way, and could commit himself to finding it. He chose the harder path, the uncertain path, the path that required him to educate himself and think differently and risk public failure. And because he made that choice, corn farming across the entire Midwest changed forever. That is the power of one person's determination. That is what happens when someone refuses to accept that the old ways are the only ways. That is the spirit that built American agriculture, one innovation at a time, one stubborn farmer at a time, spreading from farm to farm and generation to generation, until the cumulative effect of all those individual improvements transformed an entire industry. Walter Henshaw was one farmer, with one idea, solving one problem. But he was also part of something much larger, the continuous evolution of agricultural knowledge, driven not by distant experts, but by the people doing the work, living the challenges and insisting that solutions were possible if you were willing to look for them. Thank you for watching this video. If you found this story interesting and meaningful, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving it a like, and sharing it with others who appreciate the history of American farming and rural life. This video is inspired by real events and authentic historical farming practices from the American Midwest, and it is not intended to represent or offend any individual or group. The stories of innovation, determination, and community in rural America deserve to be remembered and celebrated, and we will continue exploring these remarkable moments in agricultural history in future videos.